The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed since late February 2026. That is not a headline from a drill scenario. That is the reality the world woke up to after the United States and Israel launched their air campaign against Iran. Tehran retaliated not with a sprawling ground war, but with something far more surgical. They shut the strait, warnings to tankers, attacks on merchant vessels, naval mines sown like dragon's teeth across one of the most congested waterways on Earth. Within days, the major shipping companies pulled out entirely. 20 million barrels of oil per day stopped flowing. That is not a disruption. That is a cardiac arrest for the global energy system. Now, while Donald Trump is busy blockading that same strait and picking public fights with NATO allies who refuse to send warships, something extraordinary is happening just north of the American border. Almost nobody is talking about it. Canada, the country Trump has spent the last year and a half trying to humiliate, bully, and absorb into the United States as a 51st state, is quietly becoming one of the most powerful energy players on the planet. Prime Minister Mark Carney knows it. He is not just sitting on the world's third largest oil reserves while the Middle East burns. He is using those reserves, using them against Trump, against everyone who bet that Canada would fold under pressure. And if you are an American filling up your gas tank right now, at prices that have climbed above $4 a gallon and are still climbing, you need to understand that what happens next between these two leaders could determine whether that price goes up or comes back down. Let me explain what is really going on, because the mainstream media is missing the bigger picture entirely. We have to start with the scale of the crisis. The head of the International Energy Agency called the Hormuz closure the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel. Gas prices across the United States punched above $4 and kept rising. Jet fuel prices more than doubled. Diesel, the absolute lifeblood of trucking and agriculture, went through the roof. Fertilizer prices, heavily dependent on Gulf exports of sulfur and urea, began spiking in ways that agricultural economists warn could trigger a food price crisis reminiscent of 2022. Airlines started rerouting flights around the entire Middle East, adding hours to routes and millions in fuel costs. Stock markets tumbled, recession odds climbed across every major economy. And Donald Trump, who launched this war expecting a quick, decisive operation that would showcase American military power, found himself trapped in a conflict that is bleeding American wallets dry. This is where Canada enters the picture. And this is where Mark Carney's strategy becomes genuinely fascinating. Within days of the strait closing, Canada's top trade officials began doing something they had never done at this scale before. They started calling energy buyers around the world, not just in the United States, but in Asia, in Europe, in countries that had been dependent on Gulf oil and were suddenly desperate for alternatives. Canada's international trade minister went on Bloomberg television from Seoul and delivered a pitch that was unmistakable in its ambition. He said conversations in South Korea were revolving around energy and what more Canada could do. Crude oil, liquefied natural gas, nuclear capacity. Canada has all of it, he said. And we are getting a lot of calls these days. That might sound like standard diplomatic language. In context, it was a declaration of strategic intent. Canada is positioning itself as the reliable, stable, democratic alternative to the chaos of the Middle East. While Iranian mines threaten tankers in the Gulf, Canadian oil is flowing safely through pipelines in Alberta. While Russian energy remains tainted by sanctions and the war in Ukraine, Canadian energy comes with none of that baggage. And while American oil producers are also benefiting from the crisis, there is a crucial difference. Canada is using this moment not just to make money, but to build long-term relationships that will reduce its dependence on the United States. And that is the part that should worry Washington. Here is the strategic problem Trump created for himself, and he does not fully grasp the implications yet. For decades, the United States has been Canada's overwhelmingly dominant energy customer. Roughly 99% of Canadian oil exports go to a single country, the United States. That kind of dependence has always been a source of American leverage. If Canada steps out of line, Washington can threaten to restrict imports or impose tariffs on energy, and Ottawa has nowhere else to send its oil. Trump exploited that leverage relentlessly. He slapped tariffs on Canadian energy. He threatened to raise them further. He used Canada's energy dependence as a cudgel to force concessions on everything from dairy markets to digital streaming regulations. The assumption was always that Canada was trapped, that it had no alternative. But the Hormuz crisis is rewriting that equation in real time. Suddenly, the world does not have enough oil. Countries that never considered buying Canadian crude are now desperate for it. Japan, which gets 70% of its Middle Eastern oil through the Strait of Hormuz, is scrambling for new suppliers. South Korea is sending special envoys to secure alternative energy sources. European nations that relied on Qatari LNG are watching their supply contracts crumble under force majeure declarations. And Canada, with the third largest proven oil reserves on Earth, is sitting in a position of extraordinary strength. Now, there is a problem, and this is the frustrating irony that has haunted Canadian energy policy for decades. Canada cannot fully capitalize on this moment because it does not have enough pipeline capacity to get its oil to global markets. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, the only major pipeline carrying Canadian oil to the Pacific coast, is already operating at 91% capacity. There is no room to dramatically increase exports to Asia. The dream of building a pipeline from Alberta to the coast of British Columbia has been strangled for years by environmental opposition, Indigenous rights disputes, and political gridlock. The Keystone XL pipeline, which would have carried even more Canadian oil to American refineries, was killed by President Biden on his first day in office and never revived. So Canada has the oil. The world wants it, but Canada cannot get enough of it to market. It is like having the biggest well in the desert and no bucket large enough to carry the water. And yet, even with these constraints, the political and strategic dynamics have shifted enormously in Carney's favor. Here is why. The Hormuz crisis has done something that no amount of Canadian rhetoric or diplomatic pressure could ever have achieved on its own. It has proven, in real time, with real consequences measured in dollars at the gas pump and dollars on the grocery shelf, that the world's dependence on Middle Eastern energy is a catastrophic vulnerability, and it has forced a question that energy strategists have been asking for years into the center of the political conversation. Why is Canada not doing more to become a global energy superpower? Carney is leaning into that question hard. His government has started talking about energy security as a pillar of Canadian foreign policy, not just an economic interest, but a strategic weapon. The argument is straightforward and powerful. Democratic allies should not have to choose between buying oil from Russia, which is using energy revenue to fund its invasion of Ukraine, or buying oil from the Gulf, where supply can be cut off by any conflict in a region perpetually on the edge of war. Canada offers a third option: stable governance, strong environmental regulations, geographic proximity to both American and Asian markets through the Pacific, and reserves that could last for generations. This is where the U.S. Canada trade fight intersects with the Hormuz crisis in a way that creates maximum pressure on Trump, because right now, Trump needs Canadian energy more than ever. American refineries, particularly the heavy ones on the Gulf Coast, are designed to process the exact type of heavy crude that Canada produces. Without it, those refineries would have to import heavy crude from somewhere else. And with the Middle East in flames, the alternatives are limited. Venezuela, which was briefly back on the market after Trump desanctioned some of its production, does not have the infrastructure or stability to fill the gap. Russia is off limits for political reasons. That leaves Canadian oil as one of the most critical inputs into the American refining system at the exact moment when Trump is trying to keep gas prices from derailing his party's chances in the 2026 midterm elections. Carney knows this. He knows that every day the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, his leverage grows. He knows that every cent gas prices rise in the United States, Trump's political vulnerability deepens. And he knows that the upcoming USMCA trade review, which could reshape the entire North American economic order, is happening against the backdrop of an energy crisis that makes Canada indispensable. Now, Trump is not a fool. He understands leverage too. His response to the Hormuz crisis has been characteristically aggressive. After peace talks with Iran collapsed over the weekend in Pakistan, Trump announced a full naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. He declared that the U.S. Navy would prevent all ships from entering or leaving the strait until Iran opens it to everyone. The move is partly aimed at choking off Iran's remaining oil revenue, but it also carries enormous risks. If the blockade escalates into a direct naval confrontation with Iran's Revolutionary Guard, oil prices could spike even higher. If the blockade drags on, the pressure on American consumers will become politically unsustainable. Meanwhile, Trump has been raging at NATO allies for refusing to help. He called the alliance a paper tiger. He threatened to withdraw the United States entirely. He demanded that European countries send warships and military assets to the strait, and one after another they declined. The United Kingdom said it would not participate in the blockade. France and Germany said any reopening of the strait would require a durable peace agreement with Iran, something that looks increasingly distant. And right in the middle of all this, Mark Carney did something that was strategically brilliant and provocatively timed. He reaffirmed Canada's commitment to NATO and its focus on Arctic security, carefully positioning Canada as a loyal but independent ally. He is not rejecting NATO. He is not rejecting the alliance with the United States. But he is making it clear that Canada's military cooperation and energy cooperation are not free goods that Trump can demand while simultaneously threatening Canadian sovereignty and slapping tariffs on Canadian industries. This is the calculation Carney is making, and it is a high-wire act of extraordinary complexity. He is betting that the combination of the Hormuz crisis, Trump's political vulnerability on gas prices, the USMCA review, and Canada's irreplaceable role in American energy supply gives him enough leverage to negotiate a fundamentally better deal for Canada. Not just a trade deal, a new kind of relationship where Canada is treated as a genuine partner rather than a colonial resource to be exploited. But there are enormous risks. If Trump feels cornered, he tends to escalate rather than compromise. He could impose even higher tariffs on Canadian energy as punishment for what he perceives as insufficient loyalty. He could try to rewrite the USMCA in ways that strip Canada of its remaining protections. He could use the crisis to justify even more extreme rhetoric about annexation and the 51st state. And if global energy prices remain elevated, both American and Canadian consumers will suffer, creating domestic political pressure that could undermine Carney's position from within. There is also the pipeline problem. Canada cannot become a true energy superpower if it cannot get its oil to Asia. The Trans Mountain expansion helped, but it is not enough. Building new pipeline infrastructure to the Pacific coast remains politically toxic in British Columbia and among environmental groups that form a key part of Carney's political coalition. This is the strategic contradiction at the heart of Canada's energy ambitions. Carney talks about diversification and independence, but his country remains structurally dependent on the American market because it has not built the infrastructure to reach anyone else. Some analysts have pointed out the dark irony. Canada ships 99% of its oil to a single customer, while simultaneously complaining about dependence on that customer. It is a country with the resources to be an energy superpower, but the political culture of a country that cannot get out of its own way. Until that changes, Canada's energy leverage, real as it is, remains limited by the physical reality of pipelines and ports. Still, the trajectory is clear. The Hormuz crisis has accelerated a shift in global energy politics that was already underway. Countries around the world are rethinking their energy supply chains. Long-term contracts are being renegotiated. New partnerships are being explored. And Canada, despite its infrastructure limitations, is in the conversation in ways it has never been before. Here is what happens next. Carney will use the Hormuz crisis as his primary argument in the USMCA negotiations. He will tell Washington that Canada is not just a trade partner, but a strategic energy asset, and that treating it as a hostile state through tariffs and annexation threats is self-defeating. He will push for tariff reductions on Canadian energy as the starting point of any deal, knowing that Trump's own economic advisors understand the importance of cheap Canadian crude to American refining capacity. And he will use the global attention on energy security to make the case at home and abroad for finally building the pipeline and export infrastructure that Canada needs to break free of its overwhelming dependence on the American market. Trump, meanwhile, will try to take credit for the energy crisis driving investment into North American production. He will frame the blockade as proof of American military strength, and he will use the USMCA review to extract maximum concessions from Canada, particularly on dairy, digital regulation, and alignment with Washington's approach to China. But the gas prices that are eating into his popularity will constrain his options in ways his rhetoric does not acknowledge. You cannot simultaneously punish your biggest energy supplier and keep gas cheap. The math does not work. The deeper question, the one that goes beyond any single negotiation or crisis, is whether this moment represents a permanent shift in the U.S. Canada relationship. For decades, the assumption in both countries was that their economic integration was a done deal, locked in by geography, history, and mutual interest. Trump has shattered that assumption.